Hello, and thank you for watching my talk. I'm going to be talking about Spanish English and English user identities and literacy play today. So I want to talk a little bit about multilingualism and multilingual language learners, and then introduce conceptualizations of the literary and literacies, as well as literary play or language play. So the way that multilingualism works, as we know, is that it's not just that two languages are interacting, but a complex of specific semiotic resources. So not just languages, like I said, but concrete accents, language varieties, registers, genres, modalities, such as writing. So the ways of using language in particular communicative settings and spheres of life. And multilingual language learners themselves have more metalinguistic abilities than their monolingual counterparts. They have an enhanced strategic repertoire, so they have a wider range of and more flexible strategy for switching and modification. So they're just kind of more flexible as learners. They also tend to take more risks. They have greater motivation, and they're more autonomous, and they tend to be more participative. And this is, of course, overall, not individuals obviously vary. Working with the literary and literacies in the classroom kind of mirrors this. So it's not just that learners develop a linguistic code, but they also have to have the deductive skills of a linguist, the honed intuitions of an anthropologist, and the playful bent of a poet. So it's not just language, just like with multilingualism. It's not just language, but it's also all these other skills and meaning-making modalities that go into it. The literary itself is it's particular socially and cognitively shaped aesthetic or aesthetics and affective experiences that are prompted by a text. And of course, this is a text writ broadly. So, it could be a video, it could be something that's written. It could be a discussion that takes place orally in the moment. Anything like that is a text. And finally, literacies are all forms of representation, including language, that should be regarded as a dynamic processes of transformation rather than just processes of reproduction. So taking what you have and then transforming it into something completely new based on what you've seen, but not just reproducing it. Within the language classroom, that takes place in a lot of ways, but one way it can take place is through language play. And this is the process of taking creative liberties with the linguistic system when designing texts. So if students are asked to create a new text, they can see examples of it, but they then can also take creative liberties with the linguistic system when designing their own. And there are many different kinds of language play: word, grammar, sound, visual, cohesion, pragmatic perspective, genre, narrative, and culture. Word play can be things like onomatopoeia. It can be all kinds of things. Grammar is using things like non-standard grammar to kind of play with that notion of what it means to officially use grammar. Let's see. Right. Things like softening techniques, that kind of thing. Sound play can be rhyming, or it can also be soundscapes. If you're thinking of like a video, creating a soundscape. Visual play is like unconventional punctuation, mixed fonts, or non-standard spelling. Cohesion play, if you're thinking of like a written text, it can be something like an overly rigid text structure, or if you're thinking of an oral storytelling, it could be like digression, where you're telling a story and then you digress into a different point and you come back to the original. Pragmatic play is things like switching registers, using formal and informal pronouns, use of sarcasm, that kind of thing. Perspective play is shifts in point of view, or taking a perspective that's a bit off, like a non-human, for example. Symbolic play is things like metaphors, figures of speech, allegory. Then the last three, genre play, is kind of mixing genres, two genres together. So this happens a lot with comedy. Narrative play would be counter narratives or narrative tropes or subversive use of familiar storylines. So you might think of retelling fairy tales, that kind of thing. And then culture play is things like code switching or foregrounded schemes for cultural products. So where the culture of something is particularly highlighted. So what does all this have to do with my research? Well, I was kind of curious how mono and multilingual students already engage in language play in the classroom and what the relationship is between their multilingual identities and the kinds of play in which they engage, if there is a relationship there, and if so, what it is. And then also, if there are differences between the kinds of play between genres. So if a student produces one genre and then another genre, there are different kinds of play between those genres. So in a French 102 class at a community college, there were 5 student participants who chose to participate in this. They each, throughout the course of the semester, did 3 projects in place of tests, and I will explain those projects. And then I did a project analysis on all of the projects that they produced, and I also I'll talk about my positionality in a second. And I want to stress that this is a particularly exploratory study, so it's just kind of seeing what's there. So my participants were Patricia, Mario, Andrea, Olivia, and Wolf. The first 4 spoke Spanish and English, and the last only spoke English. I want to stress that this is a very simplified, it's simplifying their identities into just Spanish English versus English, but it is kind of indicative of where they're coming from. The projects that they did for the first project, they had to write and create a video for a recipe in French. So if you go online and you see like a recipe online, it often has a video with it. So they had to create both. For their second project, they had a choice to write a blog giving advice on morning routines and discussing their morning routine, or create a video very much like an influencer of like, this is my morning routine, join me to see what it's like. And then finally, for the third project, they wrote a horror story. And for each of these, they were given examples from real life examples of these genres, analyzed them, and then were guided in creating their own. All of the participants turned in project 1. Project 2, 3 of them did the written project, and 1 of them did the video, and 1 of them did not turn it in. And then for project 3, 4 of them turned it in, and 1 of them did not. So the students were given the first 2 projects as assignments without explicit exploration of literacy play, but they were given the third project with some explicit exploration of literacy play, so discussion of genre and sound during class. And then once the course was over, the student projects were textually analyzed for the 10 kinds of literacy play. And this took kind of 3 steps. So the first step of this analysis is to get first impressions. So note foregrounded forms, engage reader response, and take note of any reactions that are experienced while engaging with the text. And then looking for rich points. So words, phrases, or expressions that carry a heavy cultural load. The second step is to do close reading through play. So you annotate the norms and conventions in the text. If there are any dominants, you kind of stress that and kind of note any patterns that emerge. And then finally, looking at these questions, what are the categories of literary play, highlighting or obscuring in the text? How does the literary add nuance to meanings or perspectives? How does it add coherence to the text? How does it help convey dominant themes or messages? And what is your resulting interpretation, or what is the resulting interpretation? So those are the 3 steps of the textual analysis for literacy play. I also want to talk just briefly about my positionality. So I am a white woman. I don't speak Spanish. So the analysis that I did of the projects for this that the students did, it might have been influenced by that. There might be things that I miss because I don't really speak Spanish. I speak a little bit, but not much. So there may be certain aspects of that that I missed, language-wise, culture-wise, anything like that. And finally, there's one participant who identifies with a particular group that I don't identify with. So there may be certain things that were played with there that I did not notice either. Okay, so let's get into the meat of it. So again, I wanted to kind of see how these students, mono and multilingual students, already engage in literacy play. What's the relationship between their multilingual identities and the play in which they engage, and then finally differences between genres. So this is the first the first project, the recipe project, both the video and the written. So you'll notice that there are 2 kinds of play that were not really used. So grammar play, 3, cohesion play, and narrative play, apologies. You'll also notice that some students did not engage in literacy play. They really just followed conventions. So Olivia here in the video, and Mario and Andrea in the written projects here. You'll also notice that, not unsurprisingly, the recipe video sound was usually used, and there was a fair bit of genre play. And then with the written, there was a little bit of visual play, but there was less play overall with the written, because it's more strict with its conventions. Then for the morning routine and the horror story projects, again, you'll notice there's no word play here, although there was some in the previous. There's no cohesion play. There's very little culture play. And again, you have Mario, who did not really engage in play in Project 2. So the multimodal ones, general insights from this, the multimodal ones are more likely to use visual and sound play because, those kind of lend themselves to doing so. And narrative stories are more likely to use narrative play. So notice Project 3, which is the horror story, there was a bit of narrative play going on there, whereas for the other 2 projects, there was none. There was no use of cohesion play at all across the projects, and there was not a lot of word grammar and narrative play overall. And as I said, not all students used play. This is a hesitant insight. Mono versus multilingual are no more or less likely to use literary play. I only have 5 participants, so there's no large conclusions we can draw from this. It did very much depend on the student in question. However, there is a little bit more to the story than just these general insights. First of all, the kinds of culture play varied. And the play doesn't really tell the whole story. So I want to dig into that a little bit. All right, let's watch this. I'm going to show you an example of some genre play here.
Bonjour à tous.
Let's see, I believe it's right here.
Ensuite, les grands en petit. Récupérez les oignons petits lavés et coupez-les de bout en bout.
So you can see here the student is holding up the green onions and putting her hand behind it, and this is an example of genre play because in a lot of makeup videos or influencer videos, they'll hold the product up and put their hand behind it so that the camera can focus on it. And she's doing that here as kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of mixing genres. So that is one example of genre play.
Bonjour à tous.
Et puis, and also that particular student, the beginning, you'll hear it if you speak Spanish, specifically Mexican Spanish, you might recognize.
Bonjour à tous. Aujourd'hui, nous allons apprendre à faire des crevettes à la queue.
So her title for this recipe is crevettes à la queue, and queue is it's kind of it's a word in Spanish to kind of for cousin, but also it very much means like redneck, or it's kind of like redneck in English. And so she's very much mixing her meaning-making resources, her semiotic resources here. So she's using her French. She's also using her Spanish, specifically her identity as a Spanish speaker, to create the title for this recipe. This is my English speaker who created the video for the morning routine.
J'utilise mon café. C'est très facile. Ensuite, j'utilise le reste du matin pour les devoirs. Ensuite,
so you'll notice here he used a B+ to talk about homework in the image, and that is very much using his identity as an American English user to talk about homework. So again, the idea here is that the kinds of culture play varied. It's not that Spanish users used this kind of language play and English users used this kind of language play, but that even if they're using the same kind of play, here the example is culture play, that the way that they did it varied. And then finally, I want to talk about the idea that play doesn't really tell the whole story. Here we have Olivia's recipe. This is almost exactly what you would expect to see in a recipe. Everything here are things that we saw when we were looking at example recipes. But when I went to analyze Mario's morning routine, again, it looks very much the same. This is almost exactly what you would expect to see for a blog that's talking about morning routines. It's got the image, it's got the 1, 2, 3, etc. Kind of steps or suggestions on how to have a good day, and all that. So on the surface, there's nothing different here. However, when I was doing the analysis, part of that analysis is analyzing reader reactions. And as I was reading Mario's, but not as I was reading Olivia's, as I was reading Mario's, I was very much struck because I was laughing because this is not what I would have expected from this particular student. So following the conventions here for him was a particular kind of play. So it's this idea that he's doing everything that he's supposed to do, but because of who he is, because I know him as a student, I was sitting there laughing because it's kind of like he would never have written it like this. If he, quote unquote, had the choice, or if he was creating this himself, it would have been very different. Or if he was creating this, on his own, rather, it might have been different than if he had done it in class. So my point here is very much that it doesn't quite tell the whole story. And then finally, this is his horror story that he wrote. And as I read it, I was surprised because we had talked about him doing a rewrite of La Llorona, which is from, I believe, Mexican folklore. It's a horror personality, essentially. And he did not do that here. So not only did sometimes he make the choice to completely follow, the conventions in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way in his second project. But in the third project, he specifically did not choose to engage in culture play in a particular way. So those choices that students are making as they create these texts is very interesting, because it's not just that these are the choices that they did make, but these are some choices that they considered and specifically chose not to make. So yeah, my argument there is that meaningful literacy practices also involve choosing not to engage in certain kinds of play, and then talking about those two kinds of projects that we saw with Mario and Olivia, where one is exactly what I expected from the student and exactly what I expected from the genre, while the other was what I would have expected from the genre, but not at all what I would have expected from the student, is that there's literacy play that goes beyond those 10 play moves. It's kind of like meta literacy play, let's say. So how do monolingual and multi-students already engage in literacy play? Like I said, most kinds of play are used, but to varying degrees, and there are some that are not used at all or weren't used at all. And instruction on narrative play with the third project on horror stories correlated with use of that play. So talking about it in class, specifically highlighting certain kinds of narrative play, encouraged students to use that play. And then finally, not all students enacted literacy play in every project. So for instruction, if instructors are interested in having their students develop skills in literacy play, using targeted instruction, discussing the kinds of play should be helpful. Like I said, the kinds of play don't differ depending on the multilingual versus monolingual identities, but the play can look different. Students weren't any more or less likely to use literary play based on their multilingual or their linguistic identities. It's really more individual, but as I said, this is exploratory and there were only 5 participants. So this kind of comes into play when talking about assessment, that the instructor might need to, if play is being assessed as part of a project, the instructor probably needs to take a look at, take into consideration students' multilingual identities in the way that I did. There may be certain kinds of play that I missed because I'm not a native Spanish speaker and I don't really speak Spanish fluently. And I don't have a lot of experience with Hispanic cultures. Finally, differences in the kinds of play used between genres. The highlighted forms of play in a genre are more likely to be used. So this is, obvious, but narrative play is more likely to be used in a narrative genre. Sound and visual play is more likely to be highlighted in, a video genre, that kind of thing. So less used forms can be highlighted during instruction if this is going to be used in the classroom. So final thoughts, I just kind of want to think that there's a broadened consideration for what constitutes play, that it's not just these 10 types of play, but that play kind of develops through the creation process, the choices that students make, and also that following all conventions to a T can even be a kind of literacy play. There should be considerations for multilingual learners. So things like having project reflections where students discuss openly their choices of play can be a good way of having the instructor understand the thought process and what kinds of play were used in the projects. And then finally, targeted instruction of play might be helpful if there are certain kinds of play that the instructor wants to stress or that the students might miss if it's not highlighted. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon at L2DO.